Hey y'all, it's John Mark, and welcome back to the Beaten Zone. I'm in Tampa for the week, so forgive the janky hotel backdrop. We recorded this episode in DC last week, and I didn't want to further delay its release, so here we go. Man, we've got a real treat for y'all today. In my experience, service members and veterans always ask two questions. How did I get here, and how did that happen? Now, we all know the military is an instrument of foreign policy, but rarely do we get real answers to questions about what happens upstream of deployments and operations because so much of it exists in highly classified spaces. This leaves us with a lot of space for speculation and, frankly, subject to manipulation by self-appointed experts, pundits, and even influencers. So I wanted to do an episode that focused on the space where foreign policy is built. Understanding that process is important to focusing your search for answers in the right spaces. Our guest has dedicated her life to working in that space. Carrie Filipetti, Executive Director of the Vandenberg Coalition and a former senior State Department official who worked at the United Nations and also on U.S. policy towards Cuba and Venezuela. Carrie makes a lot of interesting points in this conversation I think every veteran should hear. The key one is that the bureaucracy that everyone loves to complain about can absolutely slow decisions down. We know that. But sometimes that friction is there for a reason, because when Washington gets a national security decision wrong, the consequences don't stay in Washington. They eventually reach someone in uniform. They affect our economy and they affect people around the world. So today, we're going inside that process, how foreign policy is made, how the Interagency and National Security Council are supposed to work, and whether that's still how decisions are being made today, and what all it means for the people ultimately asked to execute those decisions. Carrie's also going to take us for a walk around the globe to talk about some of the hot spots where service members are operating. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and found it to be quite illuminating. I think y'all will agree. Enjoy.
Thank you so much for being here, Carrie.
I love your podcast, so I'm so happy that I'm here.
Well, coming from you, that means a lot. I know that you, as people will get to know today, you're someone who really has dedicated your entire life, really, to national security. You're one of the grown-ups in town when it comes to national security. I also consider you to be somewhat of an ally with veterans as well, because I think that a lot of veterans, sometimes they don't really understand or they don't know about State Department or the White House or NSC and how that affects them.
Yeah.
And there are certainly people in this town that I have met that, not because they're bad people, but because they have distance, that they don't really understand, like, hey, the work that I do could end up sending some man or woman to the battlefield.
Well, I think it's because I grew up in Rockland County. So people don't know Rockland. It's a really tiny part of New York State. It's just outside of New York City. And so I once heard, I don't know if this is actually true, but I once heard that we were the county with the most post 9/11 enlistees per capita of any county because we were so close to the city when that happened. And so a lot of people that I know ended up fighting in the war on terrorism or, had family members that fought in the war on terrorism. I was very young. I was 12 on 9/11, but I think that probably had a big role to play in why I care so much about the veteran community.
Very nice. And so it was interesting when we were talking beforehand, you were telling me that your original academic interests were really in religion.
That's right. Yeah.
You went to UVA.
Yep.
So what took you down that path?
So it actually always goes back to 9/11 for me in all of these instances. So again, I was 12 years old. 9/11 happened. I was in middle school and I distinctly remember that experience, as I think everybody my age does. Where were they when 9/11 happened? And I remember at the time, my middle school teachers didn't tell us what was going on. And I only found out once we saw kids getting pulled out of school. Nobody knew why. I only really learned what happened when I got home and saw the towers on television. And so on that day, I really said, I want to be a part of helping protect Americans. And I really wanted to do counterterrorism, as many of us did. I wanted to, learn Arabic and potentially serve in the military. And when I went to UVA to study what I thought would be political science or international relations, I'm kind of a contrarian. And so everybody at UVA studies political science. I mean, it's the biggest major by far. It was, and there were huge classes. I ended up taking one course with a fantastic professor named James Leffler, and it was ancient Jewish history. And I didn't think I would care about it at all. And I loved it. And then I started to take modern Jewish history. And then I took courses on Catholicism and evangelical Christianity and Islam. And lo and behold, I slowly developed this sort of religious studies major, which was a much smaller major. I loved the program at UVA. And I actually think it's been really helpful for me as a national security professional to have studied something completely outside the norm because it gives me a really different perspective on the same problems.
I see. Any big like takeaways from that?
Yeah.
Like, you always hear people say like the Abrahamic religions are very similar.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the things that I learned that are relevant for, I think, foreign policy is number one, I don't think in terms of grand strategy. I think in terms of psychology.
Mhm.
So I think about what do people believe and how is that motivating them? Religious studies gave me a really good grounding of kind of human nature and how beliefs inform action. And so I think that's been really useful to sort of understand it's not always logic. It's about your belief and your ideology. And that I think is especially important today. Another major thing that I learned from religious studies is the importance of texts serving as a grounding for your principles, right? Whether it's the Bible or the Constitution, what are these frameworks that we're provided and how do we update them for modern civilization?
Yeah.
And then I think the last thing that I really learned was, and this is one that I think is very important in DC, is just trying to have an ethical grounding, right? To always be asking myself, am I doing the right thing? Am I being a good person? Am I living up to the ethics that I should be living up to? And I think, unfortunately, as you may have noticed in DC, how someone lives is not sort of given as much discussion as it should be.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
UVA is considered one of the public Ivies.
Loved
Tough
it.
school to get into. Yeah. And a lot of folks who graduate from UVA come here to DC, they go to New York, they go to they go to all the places in the country where people go to lead the future of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Jefferson, all those, influences were there.
Yeah.
That, like, what got you interested in wanting to look at foreign policy as a trade?
Yeah. It really was still that pledge that I made back, on when I was 12 on 9/11. But I do think that being there and having that influence of Thomas Jefferson, my favorite founding father was Alexander Hamilton. So I was a bit of an outlier at UVA.
Why is that?
It's funny because he became so popularized after the play, which was, I loved the play as well. I really thought, I forget who said this, but there was somebody who said that there are monuments made to all of the founding fathers. In Alexander Hamilton's case, the way the country is today is a monument to his thinking. And I think that's so true. He really informed my political worldview from a very early stage. And, I was really a nerd in high school. I had a framed $10 bill. I mean, that's how obsessed I was with Alexander Hamilton. And so I was really happy to see this like rejuvenated interest in him and his life. And what's really interesting that I didn't know. So I run the Vandenberg Coalition named after Senator Arthur Vandenberg. Mm-hmm. He actually wrote a book about Alexander Hamilton because Hamilton was his inspiration as well. So unbeknownst to me, my sort of subsequent heroes also themselves looked up to Alexander Hamilton. So he's sort of like the OG for my political formation.
The Broadway show?
I have. I was so lucky to see it. I loved it. I thought it was so fun. I loved that it gave credit to Hamilton. I loved the music from it. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah.
And so you then went to New York.
Yes.
Your first job out of graduation.
Yep.
So before we talk about your time in New York, you have to start. Everyone knows how much I love to eat. So next time I go to New York, what do I need to go eat?
Okay, so I actually have a million places. Okay. So I will send you a list of places.
Excellent.
There's one place in the West Village. So I had the great fortune of living in the West Village in my last few years. And there was this one place I noticed that all of the NYPD officers it's like on 4th Street or something. They kept turning into this tiny Italian deli. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. They always know the best places to eat. I'm pretty sure it was called Fico's.
Okay.
And it's an Italian deli, but the sandwiches that they make are unbelievable. So that was one of my favorite places to go to. There was also another really cute place, also Italian. I'm Italian in heritage, called La Palma, which was just really beautiful outdoor, which is really rare in New York. And then the last place which closed was the Spotted Pig, which was a super trendy place, but it had an amazing burger. So unfortunately, you can't go there because that shut down during COVID, I think.
Amazing. I've always heard that DC doesn't do Italian well.
Yeah.
I'm not going to comment on that.
Look, I mean...
But New York does it.
New York does Italian great.
That's right.
New York does Italian great. There have been really good... And also I had the benefit, my brother-in-law is from Sicily.
Yeah.
And so he would come to New York and visit, and he would find all the little Italian places and take us there. So there's dozens that I really loved.
Awesome. And of course, when I go to New York, I like Jewish delis as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you went to New York.
Mhm.
And so what did you do when you were there?
So my first job was working for a group called the Tikva Fund, which is sort of a Jewish/American values organization. And they had this year-long sort of post-bachelor program. So I was continuing to learn while also doing some work. At that point, I was doing work on campuses and their views of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Mhm.
So I was doing that for about 9 months. And then from there, I was recruited to work for a family foundation where I was running a lot of their...
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And so in New York during that time, that was post 9/11.
Yes.
The city was kind of rebuilding. And by this point, you're kind of building and strengthening and forming your deeper political thoughts.
Yeah,
That got you into the world of politics.
it did. Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this was now coming up on this would have been 2016. So just before the election, I was sort of looking back on my life and thinking, okay, I mean, I was still very young, but thinking, have I really fulfilled this pledge that I made on September 11th? I want to be in national security. I'm doing important work, helping this major philanthropist fund important projects that help promote America, help support our allies. But I felt like I was I was sort of the middleman, right? Here's the amazing person who was able to make all of this money. And here are the amazing organizations that are able to do something with the money. And I'm just sort of taking from one and giving to the other. And so I wanted to do something that I felt was much more operational and much more in service of the country.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you know this, at first I tried to go into the military.
Okay.
So I met a Marine Corps recruiter, fell in love with the Marine Corps, tried to join. I ended up getting accepted into OCS. I was supposed to leave, I believe it was September 10th, 2016. And then on September 1st, I went on a training run and my throat closed.
Oh, no.
Completely closed. And I was with the recruiting officer. And so this was 16. So we were under sequestration. They basically pulled my orders.
I see.
And so I was trying to figure out which direction I wanted to go in. At that point, I had already left the foundation and I was trying to figure out, okay, how can this is actually a blessing that I have left this amazing organization because now I have to figure out what I'm doing next.
Yep.
I can't just fall back. And I thought, you know what? The best thing that I can do as a young person is work for someone with character and integrity in the field that I want to be involved in. And you'll be surprised to hear this, but looking at the political arena, there weren't that many people with character and integrity that I felt comfortable working for. But it just so happened at that point, it was now just after the election, and Nikki Haley had been rumored to go into the United Nations. And at the Family Foundation, I had done a decent amount of work on the United Nations. I'd done a lot of work on Israeli-Palestinian issues. And so, and I really respected Nikki Haley because I knew of her work as governor of South Carolina. So I ended up applying to work for her, did a few interviews, and then when she was nominated and confirmed, she brought me on board. And so in 2017, I started working.
And she was our ambassador to the United Nations.
She was our ambassador to the United Nations. Yeah.
What a cool job.
It was amazing.
Oh my gosh. That's really cool. So she's had so many titles in her career. She became her Secretary Haley.
So I always call her Ambassador Haley because that's how I worked. Okay. I still to this day, when I see her, will call her Ambassador.
Yes, Ambassador.
I can't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Without revealing too much of my politics, I admire her greatly. And it has nothing to do with her politics. I was in Atlanta airport one time and I was in the Delta Lounge and I saw her walking in and she sat down and was just, on her phone.
Yep.
All by herself.
And she was ambassador or?
I can't remember. I think it was like when she was running for president.
2024. It was just now.
It was just now. Yeah. And so I just, I'm that guy.
Yeah.
I love my heroes.
Yeah.
I love people. And so I just went up and said, ma'am, it's nice to meet you. And she was extremely nice and very gracious with her time. And I said, well, I know you're busy. She was I just walked away thinking she's someone that I hope has a bright future in politics.
They always say, don't meet your heroes, but she is the exception to that rule. I mean, working for her, she had amazing judgment. You knew that she was always trying to do what was best for the country. She was incredibly kind and warm. And I will also say, as a female in national security, a lot of the female leaders we have, they sort of mimic masculine leadership, if this makes any sense. And she is very sort of decidedly feminine in her leadership style. She's very warm, she's very inviting, but she's very tough and she's strong. And I left working for her with even more respect and admiration for her than before I started working for her. And, you know, like you, when I think about presidents or senators, I don't actually vote so much based on politics. This may surprise people, given I work in politics and policy. I vote on character. And she has an amazing character. She's incredibly kind, loyal, patriotic. Yeah, I have nothing but good things to say about her.
So I'll take a step back as kind of an independent, even though I kind of worked in the administration at the time not as a political appointee, but as a government official. So it's a little bit different, but I'll take a step back as an observer and say, what a tough time that must have been for her team, because you're now going into this new kind of conservative foreign policy mindset into the very body, the United Nations, that appeared to be under, from an outsider's perspective, it appeared to be under attack.
Yeah, absolutely.
By a lot of the statements that were made from the very top. And there was Ambassador Haley and her team. Did you guys really feel that pressure? Because you work at the pleasure of the president, but you also have a diplomatic job to work with your colleagues.
I think she really manifested what President Trump at the time was pushing for, which was, he basically had said many times, it's not that I disagree with the principles of the UN. The principles of the UN are beyond reproach, but the implementation has really empowered China and Russia and Iran, the democratic societies, the United States. We were often sort of held hostage to our generosity, right? So we funded this institution and we had no say or real influence or gravitas in the decisions that it was making. And it was often making decisions against US national interests. And so what she was trying to do was really push for the reforms that would make it a useful body that could actually adhere to the principles for which it was originally founded. And unfortunately, first of all, I think she did a great job, but there were some cases where the antibodies of the institution were just so strong that we couldn't make any headway. And I think it's because of that now, in his second term, President Trump is less focused on a reform agenda because the UN blocked it. And now it's burn it to the ground agenda. And I think had the UN really taken this seriously and said, you know what, you're right. The DRC, Sudan, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, maybe those shouldn't be on the Human Rights Council, right? If the UN had taken these recommendations seriously, I think we'd be in a very different place than we are today.
Very interesting. I know that you guys must have been under just siege by the press. And I'm not anti-press at all. As a matter of fact, I'm a big believer in the press having not a hostile relationship, but
like a checks and balances
totally
thing. Yeah.
And I remember when I worked at the NSC in the comm shop, man, there were some tough like responses to queries that were coming in, and it must have been really challenging, but what a great way to cut your teeth.
Yeah.
At the very highest level. What's UNGA week like?
A nightmare. Honestly,
it's a nightmare. The answer I was expecting.
It's honestly a nightmare. It was, it's, first of all, everybody descends onto New York. And I love New York. Where the UN is like legitimately the only crappy part of New York, right? So like Midtown East, I'm not about it.
Yeah.
And so you go to the worst part of New York, you pay so much money to stay in the hotels. And actually, Ambassador Haley, she really restricted the amount of people that were going the years that she was ambassador, because she's like, the U.S. taxpayer should not be spending $800 a night to pay for random people from the State Department to stay in New York. So she really did focus on that kind of thing. But it's just all pageantry and theater. It's not, and that's, I think, where the criticisms stem from. It was not a body where you would actually have serious discussions about the future of the world. And when Senator Vandenberg actually, when he used to be chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the late 40s. And he was a part of the group that helped create the United Nations. Yep. But he said, when we create this body, people think that he was a liberal internationalist, but he wasn't. He was wildly opposed to the idea of the UN being the supranational government. He said that the UN and all our alliances should be what he called insulating layers, basically ways that the United States can stay more insulated from the rest of the world because it provides this kind of shield. And he warned that it could be the case that at some point the UN affects our sovereignty and affects our national interest, and we cannot let it get to that stage. He said, U.S. national interest, sovereignty, and constitutionalism need to be the three primary sort of pillars of our involvement and engagement in the UN. And unfortunately, over time, for a number of reasons, I think that ceased to be the case. And so this is why, if you were to ask me, do you believe in the concept of some kind of multinational institute that can help protect against great power competition? Sure, in theory, I do. Do I believe that the United Nations is an effective way to do that? No, because we've seen how China has taken advantage of it. We saw how when it came to the Ukraine war, because of Russia and China on the Security Council, they were pushing more resolutions that were about how U.S. sanctions were affecting food security than pushing information and resolutions about the fact that Russia had unilaterally invaded Ukraine. Yeah. So that's just a very small example of the kinds of bias that we're seeing in the system.
You mentioned Senator Vandenberg.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about him and kind of why you guys took his name?
Yeah. So I love talking about Senator Vandenberg because the truth is, before we started the coalition, I did not know who he was. And, we were trying to represent an organization that believed that the country was more important than the party, right? Mm-hmm. Everything should focus on how we can make America safer, stronger, and more free. We wanted somebody who could, however, work with. He was a loyal Republican, but he worked with the opposition. He worked with the Democrats all the time, and working across the aisle is, I think, really important. And we wanted somebody who represented America when America was changing. And so who Senator Vandenberg was, he was a senator from Michigan, and he ended up as the chief legislative architect of NATO, of the UN, of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, all of these sort of core elements of U.S. foreign policy. But when he started, he was an isolationist. He was opposed to U.S. involvement in World War II. And after Pearl Harbor, he had what has been described as a sort of massive public conversion. It actually was a little bit more complicated than that. But he basically said, his quote was, "Our oceans have ceased to be moats which automatically protect our ramparts." Essentially saying, I don't want to go to war. I don't want to fight Japan and Germany, but they're bringing the battle to us. Our enemy gets a vote, and they've decided that they're going to bring us into this. So if they're going to bring us into this, let's create a world in which U.S. power and influence is strong enough to make sure that we can secure our own borders. And so he ended up then becoming the chief legislative architect of many of these entities. And we loved that we took his name because we felt that he really represented the values of what we were pushing for as a man, somebody who works across the aisle, somebody who loves his country, is a deep patriot. He's somebody who is willing to acknowledge where he was right and wrong, which is rare in politics. And he understood where people who disagreed with him were coming from because he used to be one of those people. And so we loved that he had created what was at the time the next few decades of conservative foreign policy in the United States. And he said something along the lines of, there comes in the life of every nation a single moment where you are called to do something significant. And at the time he said, we are at such a moment now. I think we're at another moment now. So he created the last few decades of conservative foreign policy. Now we're looking at, okay, what are the ensuing decades going forward?
Very interesting. It's interesting because, and we'll talk more about it later. I think one of the themes I really want to tease on is there seems to be, at least from my perspective, as a former military officer, I was raised in professional military education, the institutional educational pipeline, and alliances and operating in a joint multinational environment was always going to be the case. It's been the case in every campaign I've been in. NATO, all these different international organizations and alliances have always been almost.
They've been a given, right?
Right. It's just, And so now as an outsider, I kind of look at it and say, I'm not really clear about the United States' commitment to international organizations and alliances. And regardless of how the next election goes,
right.
I'm seeing parts of both political parties that are kind of moving towards America first.
Yeah.
Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with America first, is what I hear you saying, but I think we all know that we have to exist within the international
Yeah.
community, right? Which I know is a bad word in some circles. I was with the NSC, like, do never say that around here.
Yeah.
But like, I think it's just, to me, it's like we're almost at a really interesting point in our country, and we'll talk more about that later. But I'm going to touch on that. I do want to talk about your time in Foggy Bottom.
Yeah.
At State Department. You had a really interesting job there. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So after Ambassador Haley left, I was offered the opportunity to come on board at what we call Main State. So I was still working out of the State Department when I was at USUN, but then I moved to sort of like full State Department. And I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela.
Oh, wow.
And then the Deputy Special Rep for Venezuela. So this was during actually my very first day in that job was the day that we recognized a new government in Venezuela. So I went into the office. They're like, your first day is going to be tomorrow. I wake up, I get ready to go to work, get a phone call from the assistant secretary, and she's like, it's going to be real busy. And I come in and we had determined to recognize an interim government because Maduro had illegally put himself in the presidency despite a fraudulent election. And so that kicked off, I think it was 8 or 11 weeks of, being in the ops center, which is basically like where there's a 24-hour task force monitoring the situation, so to speak, sending all of our reports twice daily to the Secretary of State, the President, the National Security Advisor. And then after that, we went back to sort of a normal posture where my job was to help develop U.S. policy towards Cuba and Venezuela in a period of fairly intense. Yeah.
You were part of two really kind of seismic, entering into the United Nations and the world. I'm not saying that's my opinion, but many people in the world thought that you guys were dropping a bomb in the UN. Right. And now you're going to State Department, you're working Venezuela and Cuba.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a major development in foreign policy.
Yes.
That has obviously recently kind of come to a head. Fascinating. What were some of your big lessons learned from that whole experience from working in Foggy Bottom and working in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I loved it. It was my favorite job by far. I really liked working at the State Department. I liked my coworkers, whether they were career or political. I had a really good experience when I was at State. You're talking about, on the whole, people who are deeply motivated by service to their country.
Yep.
And the great thing about the Trump administration, I always joke, people are like, oh, you have great government experience. I'm like, I have Trump government experience. I don't necessarily have the way the system used to work. And I think that's very different from the way it worked under Biden and now certainly the way it's working under the second Trump administration. But what was so great about it was in the State Department, and this hopefully isn't too weedy, but in the State Department, there is the normal bureaucracy, which can be extremely cumbersome. There's one example where we were trying to get an information memo up to the Secretary of State, which basically just is, here's something that's happening in the world, and you get it to the Secretary. But because every single bureau in the State Department needs to approve it, it took 10 months to get this thing approved. Wow. By that point, I don't even think the data was relevant. And at that point, it was just like sheer force of will. I just need to know that I got this through. So there's the bureaucracy. But because I was dual-hatted as Deputy Special Representative and sort of the more bureaucratic role of Deputy Assistant Secretary, there were ways that in this other model, the Office of the Special Representative model, you could completely bypass the bureaucracy.
I see.
So it was actually a perfect role because I could help command the power of the State Department bureaucracy. But when we needed a decision quickly, we could move through the much narrower command structure of the Office of the Special Representative. And so I think that was why we were able to get so much done. As you know, decisions are not made unilaterally. They're made within NSC meetings where every bureau and every department sort of comes together and makes a decision on where we want to go. I think a big takeaway for me is I was worried that because I was dealing with countries that we didn't have a relationship with, that I wouldn't learn negotiation skills.
Yeah.
I won't say it's harder, but it is extremely difficult to negotiate within your own system.
Yeah.
People assume that everybody's going in, singular mission. Absolutely not. There were many cases where we were pushing for something as state. Treasury was really opposed to it. And you have to go through all of these different layers. You have to make the right connections with people. You have to really prove your case. at every step of the process. So yeah, so that was an interesting experience to learn. And in fact, I say this somewhat jokingly, but I always think that the sort of conspiracy theorists who are like, oh, the CIA is controlling everything or the State Department is controlling everything. It's like if you worked in government, you would know that there is not the competence to do the sort of things that people accuse the CIA and State Department of doing. So that helped sort of like shield me from some of the conspiracy theory.
Amazing. Great segue. Because a lot of people probably may be asking like, wow, okay, she's got a really cool background. She's had some really amazing jobs, but why is she on the beaten zone? Well, there's a really good reason for that. And that's because you're one of those people. There are people in the kind of foreign policy, broader national security, there are people even in the Pentagon that don't really think about what they do and how it affects soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, guardians. It's a job, right? You're working as part of a large machine. You're not one of those type of people. You and I have known each other for a while now. You're not one of those people. You're one of those people that are very thoughtful about these sorts of things. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, veterans like me, older soldiers, or even soldiers that are currently in the military. I always say they ask two questions throughout their lives. How the hell did I get here? Right. And then like, later in life, you always say like, what the hell happened? Right. And so for me, I always think back to, okay, well, how's foreign policy formulated? Because military action is at the downstream of foreign policy. Now, there is this process called the interagency process.
Yeah.
That's, as you mentioned, that's kind of like how things by, I guess, statute, right, are supposed to work. Could you talk to our audience a little bit about like how those kind of decisions are made by the president using that kind of interagency process?
So there's a few different steps to it. And I'd love to, you mentioned that military is sort of downstream of foreign policy. And I think foreign policy is downstream of culture. Mm-hmm. And when we get to the core of sort of what's going on and why do things feel so broken, I think it starts with that sort of cultural question. But to speak a little bit about the NSC process. So when I first took the job with Ambassador Haley, my job was in part to represent her on the National Security Council at sort of the lowest tier level. So back in the time that I was there were the policy coordinating, there were sort of three major levels: the policy coordinating committee level, which was my level, like assistant secretary level and approximate. Then there was the deputies committee, which was the deputy cabinet secretaries, so deputy secretary of treasury, et cetera. And then there was the cabinet level, the principals committee. And so the way things would work is there are certain roles that each entity, State Department, Treasury, Pentagon, has within their own AOR. So they can push something forward that only they do. If it's something that involves a larger decision, it will start at that policy coordinating committee level where you'll have assistant secretaries all come together and talk about what they want the policy to be. Once there is usually consensus, but not always, in that discussion, then it moves up to the deputies committee, which will then make their own recommendations, and then that'll go up to the principals committee where the decisions are actually made. It seems super bureaucratic that you have all of these different layers. I would say that the bureaucracy is both a feature and a bug. Mm-hmm. It's a bug because it can slow things down, as I mentioned, this 10-month memo. But it's a feature because you're making decisions that will involve the lives of service members. You're making decisions that will involve the lives of people on the ground in these countries or everyday Americans. And so we want to make sure that we're creating redundancies to some extent so that we don't make a catastrophic mistake by moving too quickly. So in a sense, even though I would never defend where the bureaucracy has sort of come to be, mm-hmm. because it's totally bloated, but in a sense, I think it is important that we have some of those redundancies so that somebody doesn't just say, we should bomb X country, and then it just gets done. You want to make sure that you have those structures built in so that it's a reasoned decision where if I'm not necessarily thinking about a certain constituency that will be affected, well, Treasury might be, or the Pentagon might be. And so each of those departments have a really significant role to play in making sure that we're doing the right thing for the country and for America.
Yes. It seems totally logical to set it up that way. And decisions that the president of the United States would make about national security things, I would hope would be very heavily considered and debated. And that way, when he or she receives that recommendation, they slap the table and say, let's go.
Right. And they know all of the downside risk, right? So that's really important too. You want advisors that will tell the president, I disagree with you, because you always want that other voice. And that's not being disagreeable. That's understanding that the responsibility of being in government is significant, that when you decide to pursue an economic policy, there is going to be a family that's going to be affected by those decisions. If you're deciding to engage in a military exercise, there are going to be service members that are affected by that decision. There could be service members that are killed by that decision. So you never want a situation where you don't have people in the room that are saying, are there other ways for us to do this? Sometimes there aren't. Sometimes this is the smartest thing to do. But that's why I think, as much as I believed in reforming the bureaucracy, I do think we have to be really careful about getting rid of it entirely, because those redundancies are really significant and really matter. As long as you have real experts in the room. That's a separate question as to whether everybody that was in the room was really an expert. But I do think that that's really important for thoughtful policymaking.
Interesting. And I guess that's what Ronald Reagan meant by people as policy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Putting qualified people who are experts, or at least can manage experts, right? Really well and understand Washington and how it works. There's value there.
Yeah. And what the thing is, what we need are real experts. Part of the problem is that there were people going in that were not necessarily real experts, or who had some kind of a political agenda. And there are ways of saying we need to get rid of that without saying we need to sort of destroy the entire bureaucracy.
Is the Trump administration kind of following that decision stack that you kind of laid out?
It doesn't seem like it. I mean, I'm not in the administration this time around, but I do think it seems that there is not a sort of, deliberative process in the way that there used to be. Now, that being said, Secretary Rubio, for example, I mean, you can't have someone more expert than him on foreign policy issues. So in some respects, we have somebody who's really capable and talented. But the risk for Republicans would be, if you've created a system where everything is run by the executive and 3 top advisors, then what are you allowing a sort of Democratic administration to do, to cut all the decision making out of the process and narrow the power into the hands of a few? And so that's why, I mean, this is an unpopular position, but that's why I really believe that process is significant. It matters, because if you do it one way, then your adversaries or competitors are going to do it that same way and take advantage of it. And so great that we have, a Secretary of State who really knows what he's doing. But if he didn't know what he's doing, or if the next Secretary of State doesn't know what they're doing, and we've dismantled this whole system, I think it could be really debilitating for the United States and for our citizens. So I do think it seems like they're narrowing the center of power to be just a sort of few people at the top who they really trust. You can sort of understand why. I think President Trump feels that he was really attacked by the bureaucracy. He doesn't trust them because he feels that they, have been attacking him. And so a lot of this is this sort of endless cycle of, well, they did this to me, so I'm going to do this to them. They did this to me, so I'm going to do this to them. And that hyper-partisanship, I think, is not serving everyday Americans, whether it's on the left or the right. And this is one of the things that we care about a lot at Vandenberg, is like, we're just trying to look at what's a good policy. There's a lot of stuff that President Trump is doing policy-wise that we agree with. There's a lot of stuff that he's doing policy-wise that we don't agree with. We're not looking at him individually as a man. We're trying to look at what are the policies that are going to keep America safe, strong, and free. And that's how we make our judgment calls, notwithstanding the sort of personalities involved.
Sure. I've always kind of come up with, like, as an outsider, watching the presidential debates, when I was a kid, and even when I started taking interest in politics when I was like 18, 19 years old, watching Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush debate foreign policy. I remember, like, one of my friends said, well, this is Jeff Johnson and John Jefferson when it came to foreign policy issues.
Yeah.
There really weren't any material differences. It came down to tone in many respects, right? And I often thought that was by design, right? That because there was like an agreement among the political class in DC that, hey, foreign policy isn't really a partisan thing.
Yeah.
Right. And we need stability in foreign policy. The real divergence in our arguments can be seen in the domestic things, right? But when it comes to foreign policy, at the end of the day, whether you're Republican or Democrat, and I guess that brings stability. What I'm starting to see now, foreign policy becoming more partisan.
Yeah.
Do you see that? If you don't, please let me know. And what are the risks associated with that?
Yeah, well, I think the stability point is important. Now, I will also add, like, if it's the wrong foreign policy and it's weakening the United States, then, to hell with stability, right? So we do have to, like, if there is a consensus that something is the right approach and it shows that it's not working, we need to change it. So I'm not saying we need to go back to the way things were, but some of the benefits to that stability are our allies and our adversaries know to take us at our word.
Yep.
So they know if we threaten an adversary, we really mean it. And maybe that will affect their decision calculus, whereas we don't have to use the threat because they know that we're willing to do it. And so they decide to sort of change their behavior accordingly. It's really important also just for like economic stability for Americans, right? Mm-hmm. So markets are really tied to this instability that we're seeing right now. And I think this is why we're seeing, from the start of 2025 versus 2020, we're seeing grocery prices are up 30%, rents up 50%, cars are up 40%, gas is up 56%. Like this is in part because of this lack of stability. But it's not just happening in the United States. I mean, if you look at Colombia, for example, where you had Ivan Duque who was on the right, and then it became Gustavo Petro, who's a left-wing populist. And now it's Espriella, who is a right-wing populist. You look at Brazil, same thing. You had right-wing populist, left-wing populist. Now we'll see who gets elected, but it's probably going to be a right-wing populist as well. I shouldn't say probably, it might be. And so you're seeing these fluctuations where all of a sudden people are not looking at countries, they're looking at individual leaders. Mm. And I think it's a problem for democracy. Because eventually, why are you voting for a right-wing populist? Because the left-wing populist didn't actually deliver for you. So you're like, to hell with party, I'm just going to vote for the other side. But then the other side doesn't deliver for you either. Because the truth is, most of these people that are running are just corrupt anyway, whether they're on the left or the right. And so what happens is you have these wild swings. The country's policies shift dramatically every few years. There's no stability. And the people of those countries are still not being served by their representatives. So what happens? The people say, I don't even need democracy anymore. I just need stability. And that's when you see a turn towards authoritarianism. And it seems like a fine bet at the time, but then years into it, when you don't have those freedoms anymore and you can't thrive based on your own decision making, that's when you start to realize the sort of deal that you had made. And so I think there's an important repercussion here for broader questions of like democracies, not just what our foreign policy looks like.
Interesting. I mean, I hear you saying that. And of course, you guys Vandenberg is nonpartisan.
Yep.
But many people in town know you as kind of a moderate, conservative kind of.
Yeah, we sort of call ourselves, I mean, it's a terrible phrase because conservatives hate the word internationalist and internationalists hate the word conservative, but we consider ourselves conservative internationalists.
It's great. That tracks. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really kind of attracted to your organization, because the things you say, if you take a look at some of the what I would consider to be the center left counterparts in this ecosystem here, guys are basically saying many of the same things in terms like, not in the policy specifics, but certainly in terms of thematically, right?
Right.
And the real concern about democracy.
Yeah.
And it seems to me as an outsider that the left has kind of taken on the role in the public space of, hey, we're the defenders of democracy, right? And the Republicans are out like, basically being, bombing countries and taking away rights. I'm not going to comment on that. But to me, it's very inspiring to see a group of young conservative professionals who are talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of my Reagan conservative days.
Yeah.
It brought me into kind of the conservative world. And I was actually, until you said that, I was actually kind of scared that we were going to lose that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in part, that's why we started Vandenberg, because it felt like there wasn't a home for people like me.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, there must be more of me. And so let's create this organization that tries to create some kind of a home for people who put, again, the country before their party, but who really do understand the importance of principle.
Yep.
And the reason it matters is, and not only matters, the reason it's conservative to me is, President Trump does one thing that I really agree with, which is he talks a lot about Western civilization. And what is Western civilization? To me, one of the core tenets of Western civilization is the imago Dei, right? The image of God, that all men are created in the image of God. And therefore, as our founding fathers said, we have certain inalienable rights. And so from my perspective, the idea of principle is central to the founding of this country. And so it's really important, if we want to stay the country that we are, to continue to care about principles. The other thing that our founding fathers really emphasized, and this is something that I've seen in your podcast as well, what you spoke about on the America 250 podcast, which I really loved. A lot of people will try to blame their adversaries for why things are going wrong in this country. The left blames the right blames the left. Sometimes one part of the right blames the other part of the right. Sometimes, it's all become super partisan. But our founding fathers were really obsessed with the idea, not just of a country that pursues principle, but of individuals pursuing principle and virtue. So Benjamin Franklin, for example, would keep a diary every day where he had 12 virtues, and he would list out whether he actually adhered to those virtues or not. And the reason was because they understood that a democracy, which was sovereignty for a population, could only survive if individuals were sovereign over themselves, right? So if you can conquer your vices with virtue, with the cultivation of virtue. And so I've always felt it to be, and they knew that democracy would fail if we didn't have a population that cared about that. So when I think about what are the threats to this country, I'm not thinking about the left or the right. I'm thinking about the fact that we have created a modern society that disincentivizes virtue, right? Think about technology. It's not about patience. It's about immediate gratification. It's not about accuracy or temperance. It's about rage and baiting people. AI, I think, is not promoting us to be more focused on work and have good work ethic. It's leading us to be more lazy. So it's very hard in modern society to cultivate virtue because everything is built so that we don't have it. And so that's why I think it's really conservative to focus on virtues and values, because that is the core of why Western civilization is what it is. I really liked what you had said in a previous podcast where you said, look, ideas are one thing, but there has to be action as well, right? Like ideas don't pay the bills, ideas don't build the roads and so on. But the ideas are, to me, that sort of basis of the country is modeled after the people. And the people need to focus on trying to cultivate that virtue. And when we have this hyper-partisan environment where everybody's screaming at each other, that is not displaying that virtue. Now, I am not even close to perfect, and I do not display virtue in most of my life. But I think it's really important for us to try. And that's how I think we get the country on better footing. And that's how we get people to realize that virtue matters in foreign policy, just as virtue matters in domestic policy, just as virtue matters in your day-to-day life.
Brilliantly said. I think that for me, I always, when I was doing operations downrange, when we were doing hard things, we were losing teammates, they would always have in their headquarters, they would always have the news up. And you would watch the news and you would see what was going on back home. And I remember it was really dismaying, honestly, when you're out forward doing the work. No one put a gun to my head. I'm a volunteer and I went out there, to go look at back home and seeing the media showing all the dysfunction, right? Seeing the people attacking one another, seeing the political point scoring versus trying to help us solve the problem, right?
Yeah.
From a policy perspective. For me, as a service member, it was always very dismaying to see our leaders act that way, right? And what you say really resonates with me because it's one of those things. And also, one of the reasons I joined the military was because I believed in those virtues. I believed in this country, and I was willing to put my life on the line for it. And to me, if we lose that, it's a huge problem because then you're going to have a whole generation of people that are going to well, why the hell would I want to join the military?
Right. Or why would I want to form a company that can help the United States, or why would I want to serve in any type of service? People are not going to be interested in.
Right. Just become a place where you, someone from one of my European friends who I don't agree with on pretty much anything when it comes to international relations. He said to me, he says, listen, here's the deal. The United States is a great place if you want to get rich, but it's not a good place to have a good life. And I remember listening to what he said. I thought about it for a little bit. It's the whole we can argue there is certainly no country that you can come as an entrepreneur and make a fortune. I believe that to be true. Can you have a good life? I think there's actually not a definitive answer there. I think a lot of Americans believe this is the greatest country on the earth. And, and I guess I believe that, but we're not perfect.
Yeah.
We have a lot of problems here. And I can see where a lot of Americans have been disserviced by the decisions that have been made in foreign policy. I know people don't think about it a lot, but it's true. I think lately it's become quite fashionable in the veteran community to do bash neocons.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things I want to talk about is what is a neocon? And the reason I'm asking is because a lot of veterans say, well, I hate neocons. Right. Yeah. And I think they associate neocons like with the war in Iraq. Can you tell us what are neocons and kind of like what's their role in maybe informing that kind of perception?
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, I really do sort of hate the terms like neocon, paleocon, natcon, freecon. I mean, it's just like so many different ways to subdivide the country more and more. What neocon traditionally and historically has described is sort of this group of people who started out in like the 60s and 70s. They were converting they used to be on the sort of democratic left. And because of changes in what they saw in democratic foreign policy, they started to move towards the right. And so they were brought into the sort of conservative universe. They tend to believe more in muscular foreign policy. They also are usually socially conservative. They believe in free markets. And so if you combine two of those things, belief in free markets and muscular foreign policy, you can see why with the sort of rise of concerns about overreach and an increase in sort of more nationalist tariff policy, that they would be seen in a different way than they were when they started. It's a little bit outdated now because it's, again, it's describing more of this sort of historical worldview. But what I will say is I've worked for a lot of people who would self-describe or be described as neocons, who could have done anything with their lives and spent their life really trying to do what they genuinely believed was best for the country.
Yeah.
And I think I have a huge amount of respect for them. And I think, hindsight is always 20/20. I mean, I was 13 when we went to Iraq, but I remember hearing the arguments from the president at the time. And I remember I was actually in middle school. I did a debate on the Iraq war, and I was on the we should go to Iraq. My best friend was on the we shouldn't go to war in Iraq. I think a big part of it is not just about your beliefs, and a lot of it boils down to just how do you want to use your power. And I think in that instance, they believed that because Iraq was this safe haven for terrorists, that it would help protect the United States if we went in. I don't really buy into the conspiracy theories about that. I think they were trying to do what they thought was best. And this was right after 9/11. And, we needed to do something. We needed to respond. I think part of the problem, though, is hindsight, right? Like we often judge the success based on the outcomes. And so even Afghanistan is a perfect example of this. You're right. 90% of Americans wanted to go into Afghanistan. I remember in 2015, one of my really good friends was an Army Ranger, and he had done a few tours in Afghanistan. And he would say all the time, Iraq was, not something that we should have gotten involved in, but Afghanistan, that is a just war. Right. And most people in 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15 were still saying that. So why did that change? It changed for two reasons. One, because the outcome started to change, where we didn't feel that we were making the progress that we wanted. But the second, and this is the most important point, it seemed as if our leaders decided that it didn't matter to explain to the American public what we were still doing there. And I think we see that today, right? I could give you a reason why we went into Iran. I could give you a number of reasons why we went into Iran. This administration didn't give those reasons. I can give you reasons why I agree that we went into Venezuela. This administration didn't give those reasons either. And they said it was for oil. Are you going to sacrifice yourself for U.S. access to oil? No, of course not. I think we've forgotten that the main lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan is we need to get buy-in from the American public. When I think about it this way. So what is in foreign policy, I always talk about deterrence. And that's a big thing that I'm focused on. I don't ever want to go to war. I want to create such a strong deterrent that nobody ever tries to attack us, right? That's a combination of two things. It's capabilities, which this president is focused on with his, $1.5 trillion defense spending bill. It's also will. Political will is a resource that is limited and constrained, just like the amount of javelins or the munitions that we have or the HIMARS that we have. And unfortunately, our political leaders don't view it that way. They haven't bothered to explain why we're doing these things. And that's why I think we're starting to lose a lot of interest in it. And that's why veterans, I think, who are going out on the front lines and then looking back, hearing the news that nobody supports what they're doing, hearing the president not explain what's going on, hearing the president in some cases, and I'm not speaking just about President Trump, but just historically, dismiss some of the concerns that they have. I think that's really part of the root of this. Do think that that's something that our political leaders need to take much more seriously. We need to build the case for why we're doing these things, if we believe that they're the right thing to do. And if we don't think they're the right thing to do and we can't make that case, then we need to rethink what our choice of options are.
I love that. And it's not only logical, but it's right. It's ethical, right? And for me, you can, George H.W. Bush go before Desert Storm, did the whole playbook, right? Went to Congress.
Yeah.
Didn't worry about the constitutional, what can the president do? He went to Congress to get their authorization because there is power in doing that. And also the American people, that's their representative.
Right.
They're buying in.
It's
right?
a democracy, right? And when you think about even going to war powers are the legislature. Why? Because our founding fathers knew that if we're going to decide to go to war, our public needs to support that. And the legislature was the closest thing to represent the people, much more than the executive. And so I think part of the structure of the Constitution suggests that we need to, in addition to it being the right thing, the entire framework of our Constitution suggests that we need to get buy-in.
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm not saying I supported the initial idea of going into Iran. I assumed that we would have gamed out the Strait of Hormuz. So I maybe gave too much credit to some of the decision makers there. But even if I support an ultimate decision, you've got to focus on building buy-in from the American public. It won't work otherwise. Just like you can't go to war if you don't have the right equipment. You can't go to war if you don't have the support of the public.
We have such an experienced and accomplished person here who looks at the globe and thinks about policy. And I want to pick spots in the globe that are either involve service members, kind of like now, or maybe of just general interest to maybe veterans, right? Because of the direct military kind of thing. You just kind of get your opinion on what's going on and kind of how you see things playing out. Let's start with Iran.
The easiest one.
The easiest one. So I guess the question is, do you see a military solution to this problem?
It's a really hard question. So I mentioned that I supported the initial efforts. So why did I support it? So from my perspective, Iran, there's sort of four pillars that Iran's power rests on, and it's compromised U.S. security for decades. One is their proxy network, right? Hamas, Hezbollah. That is a network that, thanks mostly to the Israelis, has been weakened significantly, starting with Midnight Hammer. The second is their nuclear program. That's been largely dismantled also by Midnight Hammer. The third is their ballistic missiles program and their conventional military. And the reason that's a threat is we dismantled their nuclear program, but they could always rebuild it if they had a conventional military deterrent, right? That's the case of North Korea. Why was North Korea able to develop a bomb? Because they had a conventional military that we knew could strike South Korea if we tried to do something. And so we want to prevent that situation. That was what, to my mind, Epic Fury was for, knocking out that source of power. And then the final pillar is their economic power, which is mostly their oil. I think that economic pillar is where there was a miscalculation, obviously, by not considering the Strait of Hormuz. And it seems like from the reporting that was done because there was an expectation that Iran would, I guess, just capitulate sooner. I don't think that should have ever been the expectation. I don't think regime change should have ever been the objective. I think the objective should have been containment. Knock out those four sources of power, and then you've bought the United States decades of security. I think, unfortunately, some goals got confused. It started to feel more regime changey to some people. The truth is, I think that the regime change component was slightly different between what the Americans were going for and what the Israelis were going for, but we were fighting the war together. And so I think that has made it more complicated. It's really hard to get out of where we are now. I don't support the MOU as described because it sounds like it's the 2015 JCPOA.
Yeah.
We had inspections in the JCPOA, even though they're saying that we didn't. So my sense here is that we need to be thinking much longer term. We need to be making sure that things like the Strait of Hormuz are no longer major choke points going into the future by developing alternative pipelines. But that's a many, many year investment. That's not something that we can do right away. So at this stage, I can see why, the American support for the war was really high. People were saying that the right was fractured. Immediately after Epic Fury, we had done a poll and it showed that there was significant support for the president's operations. I think now is when people are like, okay, but what now? How do we stop this from being a quagmire? And I think, unfortunately, we just haven't seen any proposals put forward that would actually get us safely out of this without re-emboldening Iran after we just were really successful in weakening them.
Yeah, I think that's very grounded, Carrie. From a military perspective, there's going to be a lot of money and a lot of resources and a lot of human beings they're going to be tied down in that region for a long time.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go into the media frenzy around the USS Abraham Lincoln because, we don't know what happened on the ship. But that ship has been out there far longer. That carrier group's been out there far longer than the average carrier group deployment. And we're seeing reporting about stocks of certain types of munitions that are critically low. And so I think we are at a point now where, from a military perspective, we've had a reduced capacity to be able to do much more than what we've done up to this point.
Do you think, one of my thoughts is if we had, so back in 2019, so one thing for people to remember is that the U.S. operation didn't give control of the Strait to Iran. Iran has had control of the Strait, and they're really exercising it now versus in the past. But in 2019, there was another episode where there were a couple tankers that got struck. And the way that we sort of broke through was through a multinational alliance that created this maritime force that demonstrated we're not going to tolerate this. That wasn't possible to build this time around, in part because the president has been disparaging our alliances. Yep. And so this is another reason why alliances matter, because then it's not all U.S. service members stuck on the ship for 260 plus days. It is, we have this coalition of countries that joined us in Afghanistan that is able to help us with making sure that we can open the strait so that it's not entirely dependent on us. So I do think that the alliance structure could be utilized more effectively. And I also can understand why some of those countries are not joining us in this, for the same reasons that some Americans are losing faith in it too, because President Trump didn't sort of bring them into the fold until after we had made the decision to invade.
And then I look across the Arabian Peninsula, there's the Red Sea.
Right.
I frankly am becoming increasingly concerned from a military perspective about the Navy's ability to keep that open as well. And I have to believe that we're going to be in for some really bad economic conditions that are going to hurt Americans in a major way if the Houthis decide to make that a problem.
Well, and what I always talk about is sovereignty. And what is sovereignty? So when we talk about sovereignty, people think about borders. When I think about sovereignty, I'm asking myself, how can America be free of military and economic coercion so that we are free to make our own decisions about how we live our lives and it's not dependent on some other country? And the reason the Strait of Hormuz is so significant and why it's critical that we not enable Iran to maintain control of it is because it is reducing our sovereignty. Because with their control of that, we no longer have the ability to make our own economic choices. It's the same reason why we need to divorce ourselves from Chinese supply chains, because they can weaponize those supply chains and make it so that we are dependent on them for our decision making. So this is, I think, one of the biggest responsibilities of government is to help maintain sovereignty, but that is not just a border issue. That is an issue about critical infrastructure protection. That's an issue about economic security. And it's an issue about making sure that we have.
Very good. Israel.
Yeah.
So we talked about the United Nations General Assembly, the IMF, all these different international organizations that you kind of said, well, they were always there, right? And Interestingly, correct me if I'm wrong, these international organizations were largely built by the United States.
Oh, yeah.
U.S. leadership. And I think you and I both can say that we wouldn't have done that if it weren't in our interest at the time.
Exactly.
Right. Now, Israel, it's another one of those things that in my lifetime has always been there. Right. And maybe it's because I grew up in an evangelical home where Israel was always kind of like put on a pedestal. Maybe it's because, I was the military, and Israel has long been considered our strongest ally, right, by many in the military in that region.
Yeah.
It always seemed to be like Republicans and Israel, like hand in hand in hand. Recently, as an outsider, I can't help but notice that there seems to be, I don't want to call it a fracture within the right, but there is a growing number of people on the conservative foreign policy space that are now questioning the value of our relationship with Israel. I wanted to kind of see how you reacted to that.
Yeah. I think, so from my perspective, I didn't grow up particularly religious. I have always, and in fact, so after 9/11, the very first thing that I did, I happen to be Jewish. I never really cared about Israel when I was a kid. I didn't really understand it. After 9/11, the very first thing that I did was I said, okay, what other countries have dealt with this problem, this problem of terrorism? And that was how I discovered Israel, because it was a country that had dealt with terrorist threats, that had developed a sophisticated counter-terrorist infrastructure. And so I started to study Israel, and that was sort of the birth of it, was how do I protect America by learning some of the lessons of what the Israelis had brought. So from my perspective, I think it's great that there are people of faith who are connected to Israel because of their faith. I'm connected to Israel because it's good for the United States. I'm connected to Israel because in a matter of months, they killed more terrorists on the U.S. terrorist watch list than we killed in 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, because they are able to perform things like what has been now called Operation Grim Reaper, right? Where their sophisticated intelligence penetration of Hezbollah was able to take out a significant threat. I mean, stunning, really impressive, and something that, by the way, we don't want to be on the other side of, right?
No.
So, and because you look at what they're building with Iron Beam, this idea that it's taking something that would otherwise, a missile of, you'll know this better than me, but hundreds of thousands of dollars per missile. Now it's about $10 for them to shoot a laser at it. So that kind of technology, the United States learns from significantly. So for me, I'm very supportive of Israel. I think the United States benefits from our relationship with Israel. I think that there is definitely a growing fracturing. I think the left over the years has sort of departed from being pro-Israel, in part because of what they see as an overly aggressive response to October 7th. On the right, it's a little bit different. I think it's a general sense that the Israelis are pursuing a policy that's not necessarily consistent with the United States.
Yeah.
Here, I disagree a little bit, because when I looked, part of this stems from Netanyahu's decision not to support the MOU that was being pushed forward by Vice President Vance. I also, as an American, didn't support the MOU because I felt that it gave, much like the JCPOA, I didn't think it was intellectually honest for me as a conservative to reject the JCPOA in 2015 because I didn't feel that it sufficiently addressed our interests, but accept the MOU of 2026. And I think any Democrat who is against the MOU of 2026 but for the JCPOA is also being intellectually dishonest. In my case, I didn't support either one, and I think it goes back to my religious studies training, right? Yeah. These countries are ideological. The Islamic Republic of Iran does not behave the way a Western country behaves. They are ideological, they are theocratic, and they are very willing to die in order to rid the world of the American cancer, the great Satan, right? So we need to have a much better understanding of human nature. And I think here the Israelis understand the Iranian regime's nature better than we do because they've been living in that neighborhood. So look, the Israeli government and the U.S. government are not always going to be latched up. We're never fully latched up with any of our allies. I think it's as close to latched up as it can be. I don't think that, the U.S. government is continuing to engage in Iran because the Israelis are blocking things. The U.S. government can make whatever decision it wants to make. It's ultimately up to the President of the United States and our Congress. So if there are concerns with how it's being adjudicated, I say we need to hold the right people accountable. Just as the Israelis are going into an election at some point and, in October, they're going to hold their government accountable. We should be looking at holding our government accountable for those people who disagree with the way things have been pursued.
Got it. Makes total sense. I wanted to leave the Middle East, thankfully, right?
Thank God. Yeah. If only we all could. Yeah.
One of the things I really admired about you and your organization was when Ukraine, of course, Ukraine's been fighting the Russians now since 2014.
Yeah.
Right. But it became very fashionable in some corners of conservative foreign policy to basically allow Putin and Ukrainians to duke it out without any support for Ukraine.
Yeah.
I'm not saying a majority, but a loud, possibly minority of conservatives were like, yeah, that's really between them. We're not going to get involved with that. But you and your organization have been very staunchly supportive of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I look at that situation right now and I see the Ukrainians in a pretty good position, actually.
They've really turned things around. Yeah.
Kind of like, what's your thoughts about the future there?
Yeah. I mean, well, one of the reasons why we cared so much about Ukraine is if you go back to our withdrawal from Afghanistan, at that time, an advisor to Putin had said, after all the images of our abandoning Afghanistan, an advisor named Nikolai Patrushev said, look at how the Americans are behaving. They're abandoning their ally that they've been supporting for 20 years. They will abandon Ukraine. He specifically said this as we were leaving Afghanistan. 6 months later, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What happens in one country doesn't stay in one country or even in one region. As I'm looking at the war in Ukraine, I'm thinking, are we going to reward countries for unilaterally invading the sovereignty of other countries? Because if we are, what message is that sending to Xi in China? What message is that sending to anybody? So that was a big reason why we were supportive of Ukraine, is we said the world cannot operate on this principle. We also understood that the Ukrainians weren't asking us for our soldiers. That would have been a different discussion. They were asking us for ammunition. They were asking us for equipment. They were asking us for economic support. What we pushed for was, we said, we're very happy to support militarily because we're the most capable country that can do so. The rest of Europe should probably pony up more on the budgetary support, because the United States doesn't have to support, teacher salaries in Ukraine during the war. But Europe certainly should want to do that, especially if we're doing the lion's share of the military support. So that was why we were supportive of the United States providing military support to Ukraine. Things are changing. I mean, for years it was said, first of all, we always forget that the Russians thought this was going to be wrapped up really quickly. And I think maybe this is the biggest lesson for foreign policy, is like, no war is as short as people think it's going to be, whether it's the US or whether it's Russia or anybody else. But Russia is hemorrhaging people. I mean, losing millions of people to this war. They have been recruiting people in their 60s and 70s. They're sending, as we're hearing, 50,000 North Koreans to fight on their behalf. They are losing a lot of their economic support, and that's going to continue if this sanctions package gets through the House after it passed the Senate. So they're in a really tough space. They have not made any real military gains, any measurable gains at least. Whereas the Ukrainians have built up an entirely new infrastructure where they are the greatest country in the world at drone warfare, which is now really important for the United States to understand, because if we get involved in a significant war, drones are going to be a major part of it. So Ukraine has really changed the tide. And I'm hoping that, the point of changing the tide is not a complete military victory where they push Russia entirely out of all of Ukraine's borders. I don't think that that's realistic, but you can enter a negotiation with Ukraine in a better position than the Russians. And if we had gone into this negotiation 2 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. But now I think we're seeing that that really could be the case. And that is the best outcome, because it means that we will have taken a major Chinese proxy, which is Russia, off the map of potential threats to the United States, so that we can focus on the main adversary, which is China. The best way to do that is to basically decimate their military and their economy, which the Ukrainians essentially did for us. So I view it as really in the U.S. interest that the Ukrainians are victorious, and I'm really amazed at what they as a nation have been able to go through and withstand, and really grateful to them for doing that, because it feels like they're really on the front lines of something important.
Yeah. My views on Ukraine have changed. Fully admit, after the fall of Afghanistan and what happened there, it had a deep psychological impact on me. And I just said, man, I do not want to see our country I don't want to see another American go over there and die for a foreign policy objective that, quite frankly, I viewed as low P, right? And but one thing that inspired me was the bravery of the Ukrainian soldiers. Regardless of what anyone's policy position may be on Ukraine, the courage of the Ukrainian people should not ever be questioned in terms of what they've accomplished. And as a tech nerd, in spite of how I set up the podcast today, I mean, it's inspiring to watch them innovate at the speed of war.
Yeah.
And it's very instructive for our military in terms of like, this is how you're supposed to do it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so for me, there are so many potential benefits, and you could argue that it's kind of happened for pennies on the dollar.
Right.
We always have to be worried about this thing sprawling, Putin in his last days doing something cray, but that's further down the road. But yeah,
and it's good to be cautious, right? Like, it's good to not rush headfirst into any military confrontation. And I think it was exactly right of President Trump to insist that our allies do more for Ukraine as well.
Yes.
They kept looking to us, and it's like, okay, but you guys should do more.
You are Europeans after all.
Right. And so, but I think it's really important that we participated in the way that we did. As I said, I would have a different perspective if it was about sending soldiers there, but that wasn't what they were asking for. And I think now, the new NDAA tries to establish even greater cooperation with the Ukrainians, because we recognize that we need to learn what they've learned from drone warfare.
Yeah. Amazing. So now you mentioned China, and I guess we'll roll Taiwan up into that as well. So one of the reasons we were supposed to be getting out of Middle East wars is we were supposed to be focusing on the pacing threat, as the U.S. government calls it, China.
Yeah.
Tough challenge over there. That's really a geography problem. And, I can only imagine military planners pulling out their hair in terms of deterrence and response to defend Taiwan. Do you see the risk factors in the Pacific region increasing because of what's going on in Iran now?
I think one of the biggest issues for why I do see the threats increasing. I think a big part of that, though, is how strategic the Chinese Communist Party has been about, again, forcing U.S. dependencies on them. So we're looking at this massive NDAA, right? Huge investments in munitions. There are certain critical minerals that are necessary to produce those munitions. Those critical minerals are 90% mined and processed by China, which means the more we're investing in our military, the more we at some point down the supply chain are actually investing in China. And they have done that with pharmaceuticals. They've done that with medical equipment. They've done that with critical minerals. And that's what I really worry about. I also think of course, am concerned about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I'm more concerned about a Chinese ideological invasion of the United States. And I think that's already happening.
Yeah.
It's happening with TikTok. We were very active in trying to get TikTok banned unless it fully divested from its Chinese parent company. There are Chinese national security laws that require companies that are based and headquartered in China to report back all their information for national security purposes. We know from leaks that there have been back channels that were built into TikTok code that meant that the Chinese could access. We saw evidence of them, for example, getting information on journalists. We see how TikTok can be used as an algorithm to promote certain ideas, to get children to go against their families, to get them to be addicted to pornography or to drugs or things like that. Like, they really weaponize these things in ways that sound crazy to us because we would never think about it in those terms. I think a good way of imagining it is the CCP, it is estimated, spends more money on its propaganda and ideological warfare operations than it spends on its foreign ministry. And that's been true for a number of years. Russia as well. So Russia actually cut billions of dollars from their military budget this year. in the middle of this war. Where are they increasing? Well, they're increasing their budget for state-run media by 54%.
Wow.
So they understand that the ideological battle is the most important battle. And so when I think about the threat that China poses, it is absolutely the economic security piece. It is absolutely the military piece, but it's mostly goes back to that thing that we talked about with political will. They're trying to influence that political will. And that's what I most worry about. We also are seeing how they're stealing intellectual property. They're trying to gain access to our critical infrastructure. We know that they're purchasing farmland near really sensitive bases. We know that they've set up surveillance equipment in Cuba, which means that all of those really sensitive military outposts, combatant command headquarters, and military bases on that southeastern coastline, those are all within range of these Chinese spy bases. And so that's the threat that I worry about the most with China. And in part, it's because few people are actually talking enough about it.
Very interesting. It's if you study Chinese history, if you study their strategic documents, what you're saying makes total sense. It's tough because China also has a lot of soft power in other parts of the world, right? They're making a lot of strategic investments in infrastructure. And frankly, they're in using that kind of propaganda to say, this is what we offer.
Yeah.
The United States, they're just still colonizing the developing world, right?
Yeah. And there's been recent polling that shows in certain countries that it used to always be the case in like Latin America that the United States was seen as a preferred partner to China, and that's no longer the case.
Yeah.
In part because of the soft power being pushed by China, in part because the U.S. has stopped our soft power. So we're not really offering an alternative. They see China building roads and building telecommunications infrastructure, and the United States is kind of not investing in the same way. I think that's going to change as the Development Finance Corporation, which is a major priority of how we can invest in different countries. So it's not just humanitarian aid, but it's really kind of like investing in their future long term. I think that they will start ramping up some of these kinds of activities. But for now, it's not really a choice. I mean, American companies aren't bidding on these things. We don't have programs that we used to have operating there anymore. So that's giving a bit of an advantage to China in some of these countries.
I think the DFC is one of the best ideas.
Yeah, I agree with you.
That this government has come up with in a long time.
And I was really happy to see, I think it was in last year's NDAA, they got rid of all these crazy regulations and restrictions. So in the past, Latin America, for example, so because it's meant to be a development finance corporation, there were restrictions that said that you could not give any investment to upper middle income countries. So that meant 86% of Latin America, 86% of our hemisphere, we were not able to provide investments into, or it was really difficult to do so because you had to sort of jump over a bunch of obstacles and hoops. I believe it was last year's NDAA, they changed that. So they got rid of that restriction. So now we are able to invest much more heavily. And I think that's why I'm saying that things are going to ramp up a bit because we've gotten rid of those restrictions. We've gotten rid of some of the sort of clean energy restrictions that I think especially for developing countries, like forcing them to go to solar if they have like massive oil fields and could power themselves is to my mind a little unethical. And so those restrictions have been removed.
Interesting. So we've talked a lot about the Middle East and why we have troops there, why we have troops in the Pacific region, staying very busy there, and why we have so much treasure that's being poured into Ukraine.
Yeah.
And you've talked about why these investments are so important. It's kind of a way for our viewers to say, okay, I understand like why we're doing these things.
And at least it's a rationale, right? So like everybody can make one of the things that I've noticed that people in DC don't often do, I am always consumed with this question of, what if I'm wrong? And I think anybody with humility needs to address that question. So anytime I've looked at these issues, they're really complicated. There are different ways of viewing them. I happen to believe that these engagements are really significant for the reasons that I've laid out. I understand why people disagree with that, understand why they think that we're overextended. And I'm hoping that we can help make the case for why that matters while also having the humility to say, you never know what the future is going to bring. And so I just think it's important that people, I think it's great that your listeners are following this stuff and forming their own views, whether they agree with me or disagree with me.
No, that's great. But I think a lot of people don't understand all this freaking craziness about the Arctic.
Yeah.
Like,
And it is really important, but yeah, nobody explains it. So there's sort of like two main reasons that it's important. So one has to do with, we talked about the sort of shipping lanes, right?
Mhm.
You talked about the Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz. So there are actually shipping lanes through the Arctic that would reduce the amount of time to ship goods. That would save an enormous amount of money for the economy. And so that's one significant reason why the Arctic matters. The other is because the Arctic is an area where if there were ever any kind of like military or nuclear weapons launched from our adversaries like Russia, that would be the path through which they would come to the United States. And part of the problem with the Greenland debate is we are actually at this stage, we have an agreement that we can have basing rights in Greenland. Unfortunately, we also had basing rights in Spain, which were denied to us during the operations in Iran. So I am deeply opposed to us threatening anything against Greenland or Denmark. However, I think we have to acknowledge that part of the reason why the president wants to own it is because he doesn't trust that our allies are going to actually live up to what they say when they say that we're going to have basing rights.
Yeah.
So the Arctic is really important. Russia has been sort of exploring a lot in the Arctic recently. I think there's also significant critical minerals in the Arctic, so that would give us another way of sort of divorcing ourselves from China. I don't recall the exact critical minerals that are there. So those are all reasons why the Arctic is more significant.
Yeah. And from a military perspective, there's obviously the environmental conditions and the terrain is very tough. But also there are no like boundaries, there are no borders, right? And it miscalculations and mistakes can happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a place like that. It's really interesting. I think a lot of people don't think when they join the military that they would go to the Arctic and work, but looks like it's becoming an increasingly hot place.
Yeah.
For us to go. So, the United States, regardless of what you hear in politics about, we're turning more isolationist. Well, taking a step back, we're really not.
No, we're not.
We're pretty active across the world.
We're really active across the world. I think we're much more active than people were expecting this administration to be. I think it's funny, going into this administration, there were some questions of like, is this going to be really an isolationist president? And now it's sort of moved to, okay, it's actually like very, very internationalist or interventionist, whatever word you want to use. And, again, I think this is something that Senator Vandenberg spoke about as well. He talked about this sort of pendulum swing. He spoke about like there's a middle ground between those Americans that would cheerfully give the country away in favor of interventionism, sort of ignore our national interest, and those Americans that would attempt an isolation that has since come to be an impossibility. That's the middle ground that we're trying to push. And what makes it challenging is it's all about nuance, right? I support our operation. I support the idea of an operation in Iran. I would have run the operation differently. So that can sound like I'm sort of dancing around the point, but really that's what it's about. Like, strong foreign policy has to be nuanced. It has to be predictive and thoughtful about what's going to come next. It has to be predictive about how what happens in one sphere is going to influence the other sphere. There are some really good things that have happened in addition to us dismantling the Iranian nuclear and ballistic missile program. I think the fact that our NATO allies are paying more is a really important achievement that this administration has brought forward. I think the fact that, as we mentioned, the Ukrainians are doing well is an amazing achievement of the Ukrainians, supported by the United States and others. I think the idea of looking at the international system to think through how can we make this actually fight for U.S. interests is really important. And then there's stuff that I find not as helpful, like how in order to get the Europeans to pay more, we had to threaten them. And that has redounded some benefit to our adversaries. The fact that we went into Iran without an idea of how we were going to handle the Strait of Hormuz has also given credit to our adversaries. The fact that we are still entirely dependent on China for certain critical minerals is an advantage for our adversaries. And the fact that we're not taking seriously the soft power component is an advantage for our adversaries. So, there's wins and losses, and within the wins and losses, there's nuance, and it's not fun, but I think that's the only way that you can do foreign policy that serves the American people, is understanding that it's somewhere in the middle of those extremes.
Awesome. I wanted to pivot a little bit now. Throughout your career in State Department and also at the United Nations, probably less so, you've had the opportunity to work with military personnel.
Yep.
Now, when I was at my, war college and doing all that kind of stuff, they always talked about giving your best military advice, whenever you are working with members of other parts of the government. What advice would you have to young leaders in the military who maybe are asking themselves, like, why should I pay attention to foreign policy?
Yeah. And I think it's in part because everything is downstream from it, right? Like first of all, a lot of military service now is familial, right? So fathers will serve, then their sons and daughters will serve, then their sons and daughters will serve. And unfortunately, we're not seeing as many people who are not connected to the military going into the military. And so because of that, what's happening in foreign policy is absolutely going to determine the course of your life and your future. Whether you're getting deployed or a family member is getting deployed, making sure that you're holding your policymakers accountable, which you can only do if you know what's going on. Now, ideally, it's funny, everybody thinks that I want every American to care deeply about foreign policy.
Mhm.
The truth is, I would love to live in a world where America is so safe and secure that nobody's really bothered by it. Nobody's thinking about China or Iran because we don't have to think about China or Iran because we're safe. Now, that's probably a pipe dream, but that's my ideal world. We pay a lot of taxes, and I want those taxes to go towards, making sure that we're keeping Americans safe. And so I'd love a world where we don't have to worry about these things. But certainly I do think it's important for military members to think about foreign policy because it affects them so much more directly, because it could determine the sort of course of their next years. I would also say that they have a really important role to play in helping to provide guidance on what is realistic, what we need to be successful. There are a lot of people who are sort of defense experts who have never served in the military. I don't consider myself a defense expert. I do more sort of foreign policy than defense directly. And I think it's really important that people who have experience, who know what this equipment is, who know how to use it, who know how it's deployed, those people are the ones that are most useful in making sure that we're actually making smart strategic decisions and not just saying, oh yeah, we'll finish this up in 3 weeks or 2 weeks or something like that.
Yeah.
And the last thing I would say is, when I worked in government, I had the great opportunity to work alongside a lot of both active military members as well as veterans. And when they were involved in foreign policy, what struck me the most was the morality that they brought to the conversation. I remember distinctly an episode when I was at the U.S. mission to the UN, and this has been publicly written about, where we had received a notice that the White Helmets, which was basically a first responder unit in Syria, was going to experience a chemical weapon attack by the Assad regime. And that was brought to us by a military veteran in the Pentagon who came and said, we think that this is going to happen. We need to get these guys out. And there were people who were not involved in the military at the State Department and elsewhere whose first response is, well, we can't save everybody. And the veterans were the ones that said, well, we can certainly try. And that always stuck with me. And thanks to the push that they made, and then ultimately many hundreds of people made, we were able to extract about 400 white helmets from Syria to safe haven. And that wouldn't have been done had it not been this one U.S. Marine who had a senior position who insisted, no, we're not going to just stand by and let this happen. We can do something. And that means that we should do something. And I just think that's a really important message, because it's not just that I don't want the message to be veterans and service members are victims or receive the consequences of foreign policy. They're helping to develop that foreign policy, and I think really meaningful and important ways.
That's beautifully stated. So I think sometimes, we get told, hey, your job is to give options, deliver options. And, it's almost like as a scientific thing.
Right.
But there is more to it than that, I think.
Yeah.
And what you just said just kind of beautifully summarized that. I remember one time I was talking to a diplomat, veteran diplomat, been doing this stuff for a long time. And I asked him, I was like, what advice do you have for like a military officer who's with aspirations to become more senior and maybe someday working with a guy like you? I'm so glad I asked him that question at a DC party.
Yeah.
He pulled me aside and said, I'm really glad to have this conversation with you.
Yeah.
And I do that all the time. I always stop and ask people
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And
I'm more of an introvert. So.
yeah, he said it's important for an ambassador, a senior State Department official, never to give any indication of concern about casualties, because the concern would be that in the development of the options, the military may develop an option that's way too risk averse when in fact risk is totally what's needed at the time. In your mind and in your heart, that casualties are a big thing, but you can't communicate to the military that can phase you. You need to see the full range of options, right? I just remember thinking to myself, man, this is the major leagues. Like this is serious business. And to me, like having a group of people like yourself who are so well studied and dedicated to understanding the world and know how Washington works. People can whine and complain all day long about the blob and all these other like disrespectful terms, right? But like the reality is we need people like you and your colleagues on both sides of the aisle here doing this work, because if left to a small group of people to decide the future foreign policy, I think it could be a disaster.
Yeah.
And having organizations like yours in town to do the work you do and trying to help raise awareness, I think is extremely important. I know you guys work extremely hard.
Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, I always am thinking about this question of, in foreign policy, everybody's asking or saying, we need to beat China. We need to beat China. And my response to that is always to ask, like, what do we mean by beating China? And usually when you get to the bottom of that, what you're really talking about is the United States our foreign policy has one mission, and it is to keep Americans safe, strong, prosperous, and free. That's it. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be promoting the thriving of Americans through foreign policy. And I think part of what can get lost in foreign policy is that is the ultimate mission. Yeah. You look at the state, we tried to do a State Department reform project. And one of the things that we realized is like people are not promoted based on how they have advanced the mission of the State Department. And in fact, there's like 5 different ways that the State Department describes its mission. That's a problem, right? We are here ultimately, everybody in government, they say you serve at the pleasure of the president. What that really means is you serve at the pleasure of the American public, because it's the American public that chooses the president. And I just think that gap between the American people and the sort of foreign policy leadership is why there are these derogatory terms, like blob and establishment and so on. And I don't know, maybe I fit into one of those terms. I only served one admin and it was Trump 1, so I don't feel particularly establishment-y. But look, those have been thrown at me too. But I understand, and I disagree with them, and I don't think we should use that kind of language, and I don't think it's really accurate. But I understand where it's coming from. And ultimately, it's a failure on our part as national security people to communicate these things and to have a dialogue with everyday Americans about like how it's affecting them. Because that doesn't happen that much. At Vandenberg, we have a vertical where we go into different states and we talk to people in the states. Like that's not necessarily normal practice.
That's very important.
We have learned the most from that because we talk to everyday Americans, and you know what? They're skeptical of a lot of stuff. But ultimately, at their core, they believe that it's really important that America fight for values and protect their values and principles, because that's what makes them proud to be American. It's not just that they happen to be born here. It's that, they're picturing, our ancestors storming the beaches of Normandy, right? And freeing the world from Nazism and fascism.
Yeah.
People take pride in that. And we're not going to take pride in it if our foreign policy is purely transactional, if it's just like China's. Right. And I think that's when I talk about like beating China, it's about making sure that what built this country, the principles behind this country, continue to be the principles that inform us going forward.
In many respects, Carrie, it's like the Godfather. This is the life you've chosen. It's thankless. It's thankless because the good things that you do sometimes aren't realized for generations, right?
Right.
And Also, there are a bunch of people, using their platforms to denigrate the work that's being done by a lot of people in this community who I know care very deeply about, love this country. They're not here to make money,
Right.
right? They're here to work hard to better the American people, even the ones I disagree with. I don't have any doubt, right, that we just have a difference of opinion. It's become quite fashionable lately to just basically talk about like the establishment and, all this kind of stuff. Our country is not well served by that. Our country is well served by having a foreign policy, call it establishment that works well and works well together and can find compromise. I don't see a future that's worth living in this country if we can't do that. It'll be just chaos and will cause all kinds of problems. We'll get a bunch of people killed. We'll spend money that we don't have, repeating mistakes made in the past. We have to have like a very capable and passionate group of people. And you, in my opinion, your organization represents that.
I really appreciate that.
And also too, I've got to say, I do believe that my generation, because I am much older than you.
I think we're the same generation though. You might be a couple years older than me, but I think we're the same generation.
You lead a very young group of foreign policy. You mentor and lead them, experts. And it makes me feel really good to see young people embrace that, because I believe that there are certain things in our generation didn't necessarily get right. And I think that the younger generation can make a lot of choices that maybe you and I couldn't make because we were, things were just there, right? Now, they bring this youthful kind of energy in and they can say, hey, we can actually change this. And maybe political currents out there are going to allow more innovative thinking on foreign policy. I think that's exciting.
Yeah.
As long as there's debate, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, we have to do a better job of not just attacking individual people. We at Vandenberg always try to challenge ideas.
Yeah.
But not the people themselves. And I think, and again, that goes back to values and virtue itself, right? Because that's a huge part of being a good citizen, is understanding that people are going to have different perspectives than you. Doesn't mean that we're going to not fight like hell for our perspective, right? But it does mean that it's important that we recognize that on the whole, there's some outliers, but on the whole, people are trying to do what they believe is best for the country. They might have a different understanding of what that is than you do or than I do, and you and I don't agree on everything. But I think it's really important to try to bring that openness to dialogue back to the discussion.
And if you don't think that Carrie really believes in service, she's also an EMT.
That's right. Yeah, I volunteer as an EMT.
As busy as you are, as many responsibilities you have, you find time to do that, I think, on the weekends, right?
On the weekends, yeah. And sometimes weeknights, depending on the timing.
I have a lot of respect for that.
Well, it really does help ground you because you get to engage with people. You also, you mentioned something that I think is really important. You said sometimes in foreign policy, you don't know if what you've done is good for 20 years. Sometimes you never know. It's so hard to parse out, like, is what I contributed actually why something good happened, or was it any number of other things? And part of serving in your community and being an EMT or whatever else, you actually get that immediate sense of, I know that I've helped someone. And that's important to sort of know that you're doing good in the world at some point. So it helps me just as much as, probably more than it helps the community. But I've loved it. I had a brief break from it for a couple years, but I'm back to it, and it's one of my favorite things.
So thank you so much for your time this evening. I learned a lot, as I always do whenever I talk to you. So thank you. And I know that our colleagues out there will. And of course, I encourage everyone, if you have questions for me or you have questions for Carrie, I'll just, I will make sure I'm selective with the questions. I get a fair bit of trolling, but any nice professional questions I'll send to her. And,
please do.
Yeah. And we appreciate supporting the show. And Carrie, just respect to you and your team. And shout out to Jessica Farrell for helping us.
Yeah, she was a godsend. Yeah. It took a while to get this going, but we're good.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. This was so much fun.